Okay, it's time to get started. Thank you everyone for joining our live lecture today. My name is Isaac and I'll be the lead instructor for the lecture. And today's topic will be Front-End Foundations Part 1. So what that means is this lecture will cover the first half of the Front-End Foundations curriculum. So if you're in that section, this is the lecture for you. Now, a couple things to mention before we get started today. The first one being is that we're going to be stopping periodically throughout this lecture to open the floor for questions. So if you do have those come up along the way, we just ask you wait until those designated times to ask them. Another thing to mention is that we're recording this lecture. So once we're done here, we're going to be posting our YouTube channel. We're going to make that link available to you through our student resources. So let's go ahead and get started by talking about what technologies we're going to be going over today. Okay, and the first one is CSS. So let's start by navigating to the documentation for CSS. And by now you should already be familiar with what CSS is, kind of the basics, but let's just do a quick recap. CSS is cascading style sheets, and basically it gives styles to your HTML documents. Okay, and then as well as some core CSS concepts, we're also going to be going over less. Okay, and less is a preprocessor for CSS, which is going to make our styles a lot more efficient and maintainable. Okay, so let's get started by creating a base project on our desktop. Okay, so I'm just going to start by opening up my command line, and from here I'm going to change directories onto my desktop, and then I'm going to make a new directory. And let's call this one Front-End Foundations. Then we'll change directories into Front-End Foundations. And then I'm going to go ahead and open this up in a text editor. Okay, so from here, let's go ahead and let's give it a minute to boot up. And then we'll start adding files. Okay, great. So let's go ahead and start by creating an HTML document. Okay, so let's go ahead and say touch index.html. Okay, and then I'm going to go ahead and give this HTML tags, and then from here let's go ahead and add a head. Okay, so let's say head, and then we'll put a title in here. And the title we'll call Front-End Foundations. Okay, so from here we can go ahead and put a body, and in between the body I'll just do an H1 that says hello world. And then from here we go and save all, and let's copy the path for our index, and then we can go ahead and drop that in our browser bar here. We can see that it's rendering the markup from our project. Okay, so we open up our inspector here, we go to network. We can see that each time browser's refreshed, we are going to be loading in the index file, right? Okay, so now we know that's loading in, let's go ahead and bring in CSS. Okay, so I'm going to organize mine in a styles folder. So I'm just going to make that directory called styles. I'll change directories into styles. And from here, let's make a new file called styles.css. Okay. So from here, we can go ahead and verify that was all created. Right. So next, we need to link this inside the HTML document here, right? So every time this is loaded in, it will inherently load in our styles. So how I'm going to do this is right below the title, I'm going to throw in a link, and the href is going to point to the relative path for styles CSS. Okay, so we can go ahead and just copy the path here. Okay, and then we only need a reference, the root. Okay, so we can go ahead and we can get rid of our previous reference here. Okay, so now it's pointing to that. We can go ahead and save all, and we refresh our browser. You can see that it's loading in our document as well as our style sheet, right? Okay, so now we know that is effectively loading in our styles. Let's go ahead and talk about how we can style our page. Okay, and so CSS works through a series of what's called selectors. Okay, and it sounds very much how it sounds. It allows you to select different elements or groups of elements and apply specific styles to them. Okay, so let's say we want to apply a specific style to our header tag here. Okay, and only our header tag, no other elements. Okay, so if we have just one element that's unique to the style, we can use an ID. Okay, so I'm going to give an ID attribute here, and we'll just call this greeting. Okay, and then what I can do is within my style sheet here, I can reference that with a selector. Okay, so how I do this with an ID is I say hashtag, then the name of the ID, which we named greeting. Okay, then from here, I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to set my specific styles. Okay, so these come in key value pairs. For example, if I wanted to change the color of the text to red, I can say color, and then we'll just pass in red. Okay, so from here, you can go ahead and save all, and this style is going to be applied to this element. Okay, so we go back to our browser, we refresh, we can see that style sheet applies the color red to the element with an ID of greeting. Okay, and again, this is called an ID selector. Now, sometimes we might have, similar elements, in of an element type, right? So what we don't want to do is repeat ourselves, right? And so if I have another element here that just says goodbye, well, I don't want to have to create another ID and give it, the same styles because I'm going to be repeating myself. So how I can group these together is just using their element type. Okay, so if I want to change all header tags to red, I can go ahead and say H1, and then we'll say color red. Okay, and now no matter how many H1s I have on in my body here, it will style all of them. Okay, so I don't have to target each one with an ID. So we save all, and we refresh our browser. We can see that both our headers are getting that applied style. Alrighty. So now let's go ahead and consider, well, what would happen then if we had two different kinds of header tags, right? They weren't the same kind of header. Now we're back to the same situation before, is we're going to have to apply a different ID to each of these to get a style, and we don't want to do that because we're going to repeat ourselves. So what we can do instead is use what's called a class, and a class allows us to group elements together regardless of their type and apply a specific style. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and say class equals, and I'll just say color red. And then we can give this one the same class name. Now, to create a class selector, I can go ahead and I can use a dot here, and then I reference the class name, which we called color red. Okay, and then from here, it's business as usual. We'll just pass in our key value pair of styles, and that's what will be applied to all these classes. Okay, so just to see this in full effect, let's go ahead and add these three down here. And now we see we have 3 different element types, but they all have the same class, so they all get the same style. So save all, and we refresh our browser. We can see that we are getting all those applied accordingly. Okay. So again, this is what's referred to as a class selector. Okay. So next, let's go ahead and talk about how we can target nested elements. Okay. So for example, oftentimes forms can get pretty nested as far as element goes. So let's go ahead and create a form. Okay, and we won't give it an action here. And inside this form, let's go ahead and throw in an input. We'll make it type text. Okay, and let's also throw in a button. Okay, and we'll just say submit here. Okay, so now I have my form, and let's say I want to target, the specific elements inside. Well, what I would have to do is I would have to target them each, first by targeting the form and then the specific element type. Okay, because In CSS, the rule of cascading comes into play, where the style of the parent applies to the style of the child, okay? So in that regard, if we don't want to just apply it to everything, we've got to, break it down like this. So I'm going to start by saying form, and then we'll start by targeting the input. And let's just say we want to give the input a background color of, excuse me, background color of yellow. Okay, and then let's say we want to change the text on the button. Okay, so how we can do this is we'll say form button. Okay, and this is how we're targeting these nested values. Okay, so I could just maybe say the color equals red for that. Okay, so now I'm going to save all, and when we refresh, you can see that the nested styles, right, or nested elements are getting those styles applied accordingly. Okay, as you can see, you just kind of have to work down the chain here until you get to the element you want. Okay, so moving forward, let's go ahead and let's talk about another kind of selector called a pseudo selector. Okay, so a pseudo selector is different than a regular selector in the way that it isn't applied statically, it's applied dynamically based on the truthy or falsiness of a certain event. Okay, so for example, when you're browsing online and you hover over a certain part of the page and some sort of animation happens or it highlights that part of the page, right? Well, that's a pseudo selector in play. Okay, that's the hover pseudo selector, and it's applying a style only when that hover event is in play. So let's go ahead and do the same thing with an element on our page here. So we'll go ahead and do an H1, hello world. Okay, and then let's use a pseudo selector to target this element. Okay, and let's make it to where it only changes red if we hover over it. Okay, so how I'm going to do this is I'm going to target greeting, and then I'm going to say colon hover. Okay, and now it's only going to apply the following style when the hover event is in play for this element. Okay, so let's go ahead and test it out by saving all. And we refresh our browser. You can see it starts off black, and when we hover over it, it immediately applies that style. Okay, so there's a lot of other pseudo selectors, right? We definitely don't have time to go over all of them. So definitely reference the documentation in that regard, and you'll find different ones for different use case scenarios. Okay, so let's go ahead and let's continue by talking about the CSS box model. Okay, so anytime you're dealing with positioning elements on a page, you need to think of all elements in terms of a box model. Okay, so the box model comes with 3 core components. Okay, we've got what's called the padding. You can think of the padding as the space on the inside of a box. Okay, then we've got what's called the border, and you can think of that as the space between the inside spacing and the outside spacing. And then we've got the spacing on the outside of the box, which is referred to as the margin. So let's go ahead and create an element where we apply all 3 of these so we can see them live in our browser. So I'm just going to go ahead and take our greeting here, and we'll first start by applying a margin. Okay, and if you remember, margin is the spacing on the outside of the box. Because boxes have 4 different sides, we need to apply 4 different pixel ranges. So I'm going to just say there's going to be 50 pixels on each side of the box. Next, we need to add the padding. Again, the padding is the spacing on the inside of the box. So I'll just do something a little more subtle, maybe 10 pixels for that. And then finally, we need to add a border so we can see, where the box border is, and the spacing between and outside. So how we create a border is we have to specify the pixel thickness. So I'll say 1px. Then we have to specify the style. So I'll say solid. So it'll just be a solid line. And then I'll specify the color. So maybe we'll do red. Okay. So now I'm just going to take away my pseudo selector here. And that way, it will statically run these, and we don't have to hover over it. Okay, so if we save all and we refresh our browser, we can see that the box model is now in play. Okay, so a really cool part about our browser tools here is if we inspect this, it actually brings up the box model live in our browser right here, right? So I can see that, you know, inside I've got the core element with just, you know, the height and width. And then the padding, right, this green layer is the spacing on the inside of the box. Okay, and then when you've got the border, right, spacing between the inside and outside, and then the margin. Okay, and you can use these individually if you want, like you could just put padding on top or margin on bottom. You don't have to apply them to all four sides every time, right? You do have the option though. And as you can see, you know, it allows me to, you know, easily, you know, move and position things in, you know, the manner I want them to look design-wise, okay? So that is, again, what's referred to as the box model. Moving right along, let's go ahead and let's talk about height and width in CSS, okay? So elements can be given height and width, and a lot of times this is useful for creating backgrounds or, you know, card elements, you know, stuff like to that nature. So let's get rid of our greeting here. Let's create a div, okay? And we can give this div an ID, and let's call this div our shape. We'll just give it different shapes, okay? And so to start, we're gonna give it like a square shape by giving it a, you know, equal height and width. So how I'm gonna do this is I'm going to target shape, and then I'm going to say height equals 100 pixels, and width equals 100 pixels. Okay, so from here, to see all this, we're going to have either a background color or a border. So let's just add a border. We'll say 1px solid black. Okay, so now we've got that applying. We should be able to see all this in the browser. So let's save all. And when we refresh, you can see that we have this perfect square, right? Equal height and width. And then, of course, the border is allowing us to see all those corners there, right? You know, as you can see, you know, you can change the pixel ranges, right? We want to create maybe, you know, more of a rectangle shape. Maybe you do more like 200 width, 100 height, right? A rectangle. Really, the list goes on. I've seen people make triangles and all sorts of crazy stuff. So sky's the limit in regards to, you know, using your height and width to your advantage. Now, be aware, though, that height and width don't only come in pixel ranges. They also come in percentages as well. So one very useful thing for responsive design is using the view width or view height to declare, you know, certain size of something. Okay, so let's say I want my shape to be half of the height of the view. Okay, and the view is just the total available screen size. So the, you know, that's going to differ depending on if it's a small or large device. Okay, so let's go ahead and let's say height equals 50 VH. Okay, and that just stands for view height. And then width, I can say equals 50 VW, and that's view width. And now I should have, you know, a square that's exactly, you know, kind of like a quarter side of the screen, right? So let's save all. And let's refresh our browser. And, oh, let's give it a border too. That way we can see it. Otherwise, it's just going to be white. That's going to be hard to see. So let's refresh one more time. All right, perfect. So as you can see, this goes exactly the, you know, half the size of the screen here and half the size of the screen here, right? So it's very useful for, you know, like I said, responsive design scenarios. Again, this is how we can set width and height in CSS. So let's go ahead and move forward and talk about border radius. Okay, so oftentimes there's going to be a need to curve our corners, right? So you probably see on the web, not everything has these pointy corners as we see. Sometimes they're nice soft edges. So if you want to create those, you can easily do it with something called border radius. Okay, so for my shape here, to add a border radius, I'm just going to say border dash radius. Okay, then I can add, pixels or percentage. So if I want just a slight curve, right, I could add something like maybe 10 pixels. Okay. And now that's going to give me, slightly rounded corners. Okay. So we can save all, and refresh. And as you can see, now this looks, a little bit, less pointy and, a little more elegant in that regard. Okay. So we can take it one step further if we use a percentage, and we can, say 50%. And this will give us a complete circle. Okay, so you can go very slight if you just want slightly rounded corners, or you can just make it completely round. Okay, it's really up to you depending on what your application needs. So we save all, and we refresh, and as we can see, we're getting that circle, right? So this again is what's referred to as border radius. But just be aware, different browsers require different vendor prefixes, right? So I would need to say, Moz border radius, to take into account for, not Moz radius, Moz border radius. And then we could just pass in 50% here. And then let's do WebKits as well for Safari. And we'll pass in 50% as well. Okay. And now it's going to be compatible for those different browsers as well. Okay. So let's go ahead and let's add a little more life to this with a background color. Okay. So you saw background color earlier in play when we, gave our input a background color. But let's go ahead and, use it one more time for this shape here. Okay. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to say background color. Okay. And then CZZ is just passing in a color, right? So maybe I'll just say yellow. So from here, we can save all, and we refresh, and we can see now we're getting that nice background color, right? So again, as you see, we got lots of tools to work with, CSS to make things appear as we want them. So don't get overwhelmed. There's a lot to take account for, but these are some of the more core fundamentals you're gonna need to know. So let's go ahead now and let's talk about how we can work with fonts. Okay, so for example, if we have maybe a greeting here, hello world, okay, and we want to give everything between the body a specific font. What we can do is we'll just target the body, okay, and then we can give it what's called a font family. And this comes in a series of different browser-based fonts that are just available. Okay, so you can use like sans serif or monospace, right? There's a handful of them. Okay, so let's just go ahead and use this one. Save all, refresh. Okay, and as you can see, we're getting this very like typewriter text, right? This is just one of those built-in browser fonts that we have available to change at will. Okay, however, these are kind of limited because there's not that many, and depending on the project, you might need something a little more custom. Okay, so if that's the case, then you can use a custom font provider like Google Fonts. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and head over to Google Fonts. And as you can see, we're just presented with all these great different fonts we can use. And we just scroll down until we find one that we like. Okay, so maybe this one. And you'll click on See Specimen. And you'll review all the casing to make sure all the characters line up with what you want. And all the performance is up to your speed. And then we can go ahead and select the font. And they're going to give us a couple different options. I'm just going to use the standard embed. So we'll copy the link here. And then we head back to our index, and we need to paste that above our style sheet. That way it can load in this indie flower font before we use that within the style sheet here. Okay, so as we can see, it says we can use font family indie cursive or indie flower. And as you notice, the backup font that's provided is cursive. And that's in the event that, let's say, this link fails to load, right? That way, we still have a a selected font. It just doesn't revert to the default browser font. Okay, so now let's save all, and let's see this in action. Okay, so we refresh, and we can see we got our own custom font. So it's a lot of information, but don't expect you to remember all at once. But let's go ahead and take a moment to open up the floor, and let's see if anyone has any questions on what we've been over so far. Okay, so the floor is, your mics are unmuted. Feel free to ask questions if you have them.
Yes, do have a question for you, Isaac. This is David Emery. I saw what you just did with the Indie Flower. Did you link in the website for Google, or does it automatically somehow know this?
Yeah, I linked in my index here.
Okay. I see it here.
Yeah.
I just missed that.
Yeah, no worries. All right. Any other questions before we move on? Let's see.
Is it?
Okay, doesn't look like it. All right, so let's go ahead and let's continue. Yeah. You everyone. Okay, and now let's go ahead and talk about something called a media query. Okay, so a media query is a way for us to define an expression, and when that expression evaluates to true, it will then apply a specific style. And this is extremely useful for responsive design, okay? And probably the most common context it's used in is to monitor the view width and the width of your screen. And when it gets to a certain width, a specific style is applied to change things, right? So let's go ahead and let's add a media query and see how they work. So I'm going to start by just giving this element a specific ID, okay, and then we'll call this greeting, okay. And then I'm going to start off by saying @media. Then I can pass in a rule, and I'm going to say my rule is min width equals, let's just say 800 pixels. Okay, and then I target the element, which we call greeting. And I can apply a certain, specific style, right? So, in my case, if it starts at H1, maybe I want to change it to a, slightly smaller font, right? So I'll go ahead and say font size, and let's just say 10px. Okay, so now every time this evaluates to true, it will apply the style. Okay, so we save all, and we refresh. Okay, and we can see that because, that isn't, that's being applied. And then we can see that as this changes, right, and it goes below 800, then it stops applying that style. And then if it is the minimum width of 800, it will apply that style. Okay, so we can do the same thing with the reverse, right? We could say max width. Okay, save all, and refresh. We can see now it's the opposite. So now anytime that, go under, right, we're going to start seeing the same thing. Okay, so media queries comes in all shapes and sizes. Like I said, the most common context you're going to see it with is watching screen width, and which it reads as a certain, size, you're going to apply specific styles, and that's how you can make things look good on mobile versus tablet versus desktop, right? You can hide things and change their colors, whatever else you need to do with the media query. Alrighty, so that covers some of the more core fundamentals of CSS. So now let's go ahead and let's move on to the topic of less. Okay, and as we discussed at the very beginning, less is a preprocessor for CSS. So what this means is we're still writing CSS, how we write selectors and all that doesn't change. We just have more options now to write more dynamic code instead of it being so static, okay? And we'll go over, you know, each thing that Les helps us out with. Okay, so let's first start by installing it. So to install it, you're going to need the Bower Package Manager. And if you don't have that, you can get it for free by going to bower.io and installing it. And once that's installed, we can go up and pull up our command line. We can start by initializing the bower.json file so we can track all of our installations. So I'll say Bower, oops, actually, let's make sure we're in our root directory, and then we can say Bower init. Okay, so it's just gonna ask us, you know, a bunch of different questions, and I'm just gonna use all the default prompts because, you know, none of the questions are really pertinent to functionality or anything like that. Alrighty. Okay, so as you can see, generates this bower.json file. Now I can install Les and track it here. So I'm going to do that now. So we'll say Bower install Les -save. And it's going to install Les for us. So we'll just give it a minute to do that. And we'll work on setting up the rest of it. Okay, so as you can see, it was tracked here, and then it was imported right here in our Bower components. Alrighty, so now we know that's brought in. Let's go ahead and let's link it up. So in our Bower components, I'm going to come to dist, and we're going to grab the minified version, okay, because it's the compact and more performant version of the regular. So we'll copy the path for that. And then right under our style sheet here, I'm going to throw in a script, a source, pointing to the relative path for the Les script right here. Okay. So next, within our styles, let's go ahead and add, let's change directories into styles, and then we will create styles les.js. Okay. What we can do from here is we need to change our reference to our style sheet. Okay, so instead of styles.css, let's go ahead and let's rename this, and let's call this styles.les. Okay, and from here, I'm going to do the same thing with my reference, styles.les. And now I'm going to be able to run Les with my program. So see it all in action. Let's save all, and let's run this on a server. Okay, so if you don't have a server yet, you can install one really easily by running http install. Okay, so we can say npm install -g http-server. Okay, so I'm not going to run that because I already have it installed on my machine. And once you have that installed, we can then run from there http-server. Okay, as you can see, it's listening in on local port 8080 for us. So let's go ahead and navigate to that port. And let's see here. Oh, it's just a Chrome error. If we refresh, that'll go away. So as we can see, it's letting us know in our console, right? It's rendering Les successfully. Everything is working. Okay, so now let's go ahead and talk about why we're using Les in the first place, and then we'll go ahead and start, you know, learning how to use it. Okay, and it's 5 main reasons. It helps us accomplish or overcome 5 big problems with static CSS. Okay, so those 5 problems are the color problem, the duplication problem, the cascading problem, the calculation problem, and the importing problem. So let's just start with the color problem. Okay, so for instance, if I have a company color, let's say, okay, so I can come here, okay, and I'll say company color, okay, and maybe the color is just red, okay. Well, then I could have another element that, let's say, is maybe the navbar text. Okay. Oops. And I also want to make that color red. Okay. And as you can see, I could have several elements that have a color red. Okay. And then what could happen is in the future, I could maybe want to change that to maybe a different shade of red or something to that nature. So what I'm going to have to do with static CSS is I'm going to have to go through and find every place there's red and change it out for that new shade, which is not good. That's not very maintainable. So instead, with less, we can use a variable to dynamically pass in a value to each of these. And if we need to change it later, we only have to change it in one place, and it will immediately ripple from there. So let's go ahead and let's create a less variable. How we can do this with the @ symbol. And then we just have to declare the name of our, how do you say it, color. So maybe we'll say app theme. Okay. And then we're going to go ahead and give it the color of red. Okay, so now I can take app theme and I can pass it as the value for each of these. And now later, if I ever want to change it, I only have to update it here and it will immediately change everywhere else. So let's save it all and let's refresh. And oh, I don't actually have any elements with these styles on here. So let's go ahead and let's apply these. Okay, so let's just do class equals company color, and we'll do H2, and class equals navbar text. Okay, so we save all, refresh. Okay, as we can see, we get these two different elements, right? They're both colored red, but we only had to declare the color red once, right here. And now, if I need to change this in the future, I'll just change it right here. And now, it's just going to change everywhere else, and I don't have to go through and update it like, 1,000 times. So we save all, and we refresh. Just like that, it affects every single element using that app theme. Okay? So that's how less variables help us fix the color problem with static CSS. Next, let's talk about how it helps us with our duplication problem. Okay, so you might have remembered earlier when we were creating a border radius, we did something like this. We said, we had our element, and then we said border, and then we gave it a border radius. And then we gave it a vendor prefix for each one. Okay, so we would say Moz border radius. And WebKit border radius. Okay. So imagine if we have two different elements. Okay, element 1, element 2. Okay, so let's go ahead and apply these to these two elements here. So as we can see, hold on here. I'm not getting any border around these. Border. Oh, because I made these IDs instead of classes. All right, so let's try that again. Okay, so as you can see, I'm getting the borders, right, the border radius, everything like that. But I'm repeating myself really hardcore, right? All this is relatively the same. So how I can avoid this duplication is I will simply create a mix-in, which will take in a dynamic size and apply that. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to call this, let's call this rounded corners. Okay, and it'll take in a size. Okay, and then we're going to apply that size to all these different aspects of the border radius. Okay, so we're going to go ahead and say size. Oops. Okay, add size and add size. Okay, so now what this allows us to do is we can pass in one mix-in for each of these elements instead of having to pass in all of these, right? And we just give it a specific element size. So I'm just going to say rounded corners, and the size I'm going to give it is 10px. Okay, and let's say maybe for this one I want a different size, so I'll give it maybe 50px. Okay, we save all, and we refresh. Okay, as we can see, these have two different border radiuses, except I just use one mix-in for each of them, right? And that covered all my bases right here, so I didn't have to repeat those and duplicate myself a bunch. So that's how less helps us overcome the duplication problem. Next, let's talk about how it helps us overcome our cascading problem. So referencing back to earlier in our lecture, you might remember when we had to target elements inside a form, right? We said form, input, and then we applied the styles, right? And then we said form button, and we applied the styles, okay? And while that might not be so bad for a smaller form, most forms are generally very large, okay? And you're going to be saying form this, form that, right? And so to help, what we can do is we can just nest all of these inside a single selector and manage it from there. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to add a form here, and we'll give this form no action. We'll give it an input, type of text, and we'll give it a button. Type submit. Okay, and now to target everything, we just start by creating a parent form selector, and then I'll start with the input, and I'll give it a background color of yellow. And let's go ahead and let's pass in the button. Okay, and we will give it a color of red. Okay, so as you can see, this is much more clean, much more concise. We don't have to repeat form a bunch of times, right? And it's all cascading nice. We save all, and we refresh. You can see that those styles are being applied to the form, all under one parent selector. Okay, so that's how less helps us overcome the cascading problem. Next, let's talk about how it helps us overcome the calculation problem. Okay, so for example, in regular static CSS, we have no ability to calculate. We just pass in a static value, and that's what we're stuck with. Okay, but with less, we can actually give more dynamic values in this way. So, for example, let's say I have an app that is going to have a base HTML font size, and then I want my header tag to be always 10 over that. Okay, so in static CSS, how I'd approach this is I would say HTML, and give it base size for the HTML. So I'd say font size, and we'd say maybe this is 14 pixels. Okay, and then if we wanted to style our header tags, and I wanted to make this 10 more than this, I would have to manually calculate that in my head and statically pass that in. Okay, so I'd say font size equals 24 pixels. Okay, but the problem with this is in the future, if I ever change my HTML font size, well, then I'm going to have to go down the line and change everything else that depended on that, right? And that's not very maintainable or efficient. Okay, So what we can do is, instead of that, we can use a variable to represent a single base size and use calculation to give us 10 plus the actual base size itself. Okay, so let's go ahead and just throw in a header tag here. Say hello world. Okay, and then from here, let's go ahead and let's add a variable called base size. We'll make it equal to 14 pixels. And then what we're going to do is we're going to take the base font size. We're going to pass it in for the HTML. And then for the H1, we're just going to say base size plus 10. And this way, now if we ever need to update things, we can simply just change the base size here, and it's going to change everywhere else for us. Okay, so let's see this in action. We'll save all, and we refresh, and we can see that this H1 is adding 10 pixels plus the 14, which is equal to 24. So now I can just change this. Maybe this is 54 now. It's just going to add 10 plus that. So we should get 64 pixel header. And there we go, just as expected. So that's how it helps us overcome this calculation problem. Okay, and then lastly, it helps us conquer the importing problem. Okay, so typical design setup, you're going to see a series of different CSS style sheets, right? So you're going to see like, oh, this is going to go to the styles for my footer and the styles for my nav bar, and these will be my icons, right? And so for each of these, that the server's got to make a ping for, it's going to slow down the performance of our overall load speed. Okay, so to avoid this, we can use less and a single import to greatly improve our performance in the way that we don't have to load in everything separately. Okay, so that about wraps it up. Let's go ahead and open the floor again to see if anyone has any last questions before we end the call today. So the floor is open. If you have any last questions, feel free to ask them.
How do you do the actual import in Less?
How do you do the actual import?
Yeah.
You just use the import tag. Okay, so you come here, you say import, and then you just give a URL. And then you just need to import, whatever specific thing you need at that instance. But it's generally the same as, importing it here. You're just not using a link in your HTML, if that makes sense. But overall, practice makes perfect. It's kind of weird at first if you're used to using static CSS. But again, just remember that it's a preprocessor and it's not like a whole new language or anything. It's just meant to like make our static CSS more efficient. Yeah, any other questions today? Okay, all right. So if no one has any other questions, thanks everyone for coming. Have a great rest of your day, and happy coding out there.